In this video, we're going to take a look at how to create a SSAS data source. Creating a data source isn't difficult per se, but making the right selections can be. Let's go ahead and start by launching the wizard when we right-click on the data source icon and choose New Data Source. When the wizard appears, we just advance it to the next screen. And if you've made some data sources previously in Visual Studio, you'll see a list of them on the left-hand side here, where I'm circling. On the other hand, if you've never made any of them, you'll see it blank, and you can just hit the New button here. Hitting the New button launches a new wizard, and the trick is to type in the name of your server. Now, if you know the name of your computer, you can just type in your computer name here. You have to be kind of mindful of this though, because there's a number of options. First, you can find out your computer name by right-clicking and going to the Properties sheet on your Start menu. In my case, it's the Northwest Tech 01 or -01. That's my computer name. So I could type in Northwest Tech -01, and that would be appropriate. That would tell you to connect to my own server. However, it turns out that I have installed SQL Server a number of times on this particular machine. So when I come down here and I take a look at the wrong place, SQL Server 2012, configuration tools, and launch it. It being the SQL Server Configuration Manager. I'll see that there's a couple of different installations of the SQL Server database engine. Now, you'll get used to learning what the icons mean. But basically, the way it works is, if it says Microsoft SQL Server, they're talking about the database engine. Otherwise, it'll say Analysis Server, Integration Server, or Reporting Server. And I'm using the word server and services interchangeably here. Some places Microsoft says it's Reporting Server or Analysis Server, and other places they say services. It's not real consistent, you just have to live with it. If you've installed SQL Server Express, in addition to just a normal installation of SQL Server, it should show up. But I could install a third installation of SQL Server, and if I did, what would happen is that I'd see SQL Server typed in again below, same icon. And then in the parentheses, whatever additional identifying name I dreamed up. So if I did the installation again and I chose a new installation name of, I don't know, test server, it would be that. Then it would show up like that. I don't know why Microsoft did this, but when you see this option here where it says MS SQL Server, that is the equivalent to the default instance. That's what they call it, a default instance. And a default instance is different than a secondary or named instance. SQL Server Express is a named instance. And if I installed another installation of SQL Server and called it Test Server, that would be a named instance as well. I'm not sure what the limit is on how many instances of SQL Server you can install. Probably only a few, because each one takes up a certain amount of RAM. But certainly more than enough for most people, and even most companies. For the most part, we're going to be assuming you're using the default instance, but be aware, if you're choosing a named instance, you'll have to put a slash and the name of the named instance afterwards. So for my example, if I had installed a third installation of SQL Server and I called it Test Server, it would be the name of my computer / test server. And one thing that happens all the time is people mistakenly put a / instead of a \, since that's a convention we use on the internet, etc. You can use the drop-down box to go searching for things, but I gotta tell you, sometimes the drop-down box can take its sweet time finding things. So I'm not recommending that you do that. Microsoft figured that people connecting to their own machine would be easier if they offered an alias for your own machine, and so they did. In fact, they offered 3. One was called localhost. Localhost is the same thing as the name of your computer. It just means come back and connect to my own computer. Of course, if I was sitting at a laptop, and I'm currently sitting at my desktop, and I wanted to connect to from my laptop to my desktop, well then what I would do is I'd put in the computer name, because localhost would mean come back to my own individual machine or my laptop. Microsoft also included the word local. Instead of localhost, you can use local, but for some reason, I have no clue why, they chose to decorate the word local with parentheses. Now be aware, I get questions about this all the time too. Why won't it connect if I type in localhost with parentheses? That's because it's not the right combination. It does not mean anything to the computer. It's only the word local that has the parentheses. A third option, which is probably the easiest of all, is just to use a simple period. The period also means connect to your own machine. Often I use that when I'm not trying to demonstrate something to somebody, just because it's so easy to type. In my demonstrations, I'll often go ahead and type out a full name like localhost or the computer name. Be aware that these are aliases for your own machine. So, the fact of the matter is that the aliases aren't all created equal, nor do they always run successfully. So if for some reason you cannot connect using localhost, or a simple period, try your computer name. That should always be your first choice because it's explicit in trying to indicating what you're trying to connect to. Now, once you've chosen the server that you wish to connect to, the next choice is which database you want to connect to. Analysis server cubes are built upon databases. So, what I would do is I'd go through and I'd use this drop-down box to select the database or type it in if I wanted to. Oh, looks like I rolled my mouse button and they showed me my Express edition. You can use the drop-down here and it works very quickly. There's no real problem with it, unlike the drop-down above. Let's say that, as per my book, I want to go through and use a data warehouse I perhaps created, such as, let's see, the data warehouse for the pub sales. I can hit test connection to see if it's going to work, but if I got this far, chances are that drop down works, you're connected, and you're good to go. So, to reiterate, you put in the name of your server. If you have a named instance, you need to put a / and put the named instance in there as well. You choose the name of your database, and you say OK. Now you can see that it shows up here. And actually, next time we go through and make another analysis server, reporting server, or integration server project, we'll actually see that data connection still listed there. It's stored away from the project as kind of a backup, so you don't have to reconfigure this each and every time. Now we advance the wizard and we get to probably the hardest part of configuring the data source. That's choosing which account you're going to use to connect to the analysis server database engine and the SQL server database engine. Now, here's the upsides and the downsides of the choices. Your best choice is probably to put in your own computer name, followed by whatever account name you log in as. Now, currently, I am logged in using my admin account. On this particular computer. I am not using a domain account. It's in a work group. And when you're in a work group, you put the name of your computer. You can also use a dot. And then followed by whatever name you logged in as. Now, I could be logged in as Randall, but in this case, I've chosen to log in as admin. Just to remind everybody that you should be logged in as an administrator. Next, I have to include the password. If you are working with a domain, such as if you are working off a laptop that your company gave you, the domain should go in here. For example, at Microsoft, they use the Redmond domain all the time. And as such, they'd put in like the Redmond domain and continue with whatever name they log in as. That's not the case on my machine, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the name of my machine and the password. Now, in order for Analysis Server to do what it has to do, it needs to connect from the original data source, this is typically a data warehouse of some type, to the Analysis Server Cube database. Let me kind of give you an example. I'm going to go ahead and connect to my database engine here on SQL Server 2012. Now, I have a lot of databases, but the one that we're currently connected to is this DW Pub Sales. Now, in addition to the database engine from Management Studio, you can connect to the Analysis Server engine. I want the standard one, my default installation of Analysis Server, so I'll choose that and make my connection. It's taking a while. I better go check to make sure it's running. Yep, here it is. The green arrow indicates it's running, and of course the text does as well. Finally, I get connected. Here, I've created a new database called Pubs BI Cubes. And if I expand that, I'll see the cube inside. Cubes are analogous to a table, or actually a set of tables. And the language you use to query the cube is MDX. Kind of the equivalent, but not exactly the equivalent, of querying a fact table would be writing a select statement in MDX. In a later video, I'm going to actually be talking about how to use MDX. But for right now, we're just going to kind of relax. I'm in the wrong, got the wrong database here, I think. Yes, I do. Let's choose titles. Well, I guess it would. MDX takes a little bit of explaining, so we'll have to kind of wait on that. But the deal is that you take data from the database engine and its fact table, and you copy the data over to the analysis server engine and its cube, and then you get your report data. So in order to accomplish that, what has to happen is that you need to have an account that can both connect to the database engine and retrieve data, and connect to the analysis server engine and either retrieve data, or actually, more specifically in this case, be able to write the data, store it. If you cannot connect to both the database engine and the cube engine, analysis server and SQL server, then with the account that you're using in your configuration screen, you will not be able to go ahead and continue processing and developing your cube correctly. So it's always a good idea to take a few minutes and make sure that you log in with whatever account you're going to use, and verify that you can connect to the database engine and the cube engine. To tell you the truth, you don't even have to run the select statements. Just being able to connect is typically sufficient to get you going. There's a couple other options here on the screen. One is to use a service account. Checking that will allow now the project to go ahead and try to use whatever account the analysis server is currently running under. This one's running under an account called MS SQL Server OLAP Service. This account is created at the time that you install SQL Server. Its purpose in life is to act as a particular account that analysis server can use with basically the bare permissions to get its job done. If that account cannot log in to the SQL Server database engine, you're not going to be able to copy the data over. There's one for SQL Server Agent, but I don't see the other one. I do see one for Admin. And actually, to tell you the truth, if I go over to Analysis Server, right-click, and go to Properties, there's a security setup, and I'll see that the admin account's been added there as well. The service account is typically not appropriate. For one thing, the administrator typically does not give high-level permissions to this account, and it may only work on a given machine. It can be used if your network administrator has things configured just right, but most of the time you actually want to specify a particular Windows user account. Now, currently, I am logged on as administrator, the one that actually is shown here on the screen. So if I were to use the current credentials, while my project was running in Visual Studio, things should work, because it would just pass over my current credentials to do the job. The problem is that once I send it off to the server, once it gets deployed to the server, the current credentials is no longer the human being running Visual Studio. The current credentials are associated with the analysis server again. And once again, we have an issue where it's using a service account. The final choice is an automatic mode. The automatic mode is kind of odd. It switches between using the current user account and the service account depending on the operation you're doing. So while it's possible to use any of these three options here, and often it'll work in Visual Studio, it's not your best choice. You're usually better off to take the plunge, type in the actual account you want to use, the name and password accordingly. I would say that the biggest problem people have creating data sources in Analysis Server is not using the right account. This continually happens, and I get several emails a week about how to connect. Eventually people finally just kind of give up on using the automated features and just type in the correct name and password. But by then they've actually been quite frustrated. I would say that unless you have a good reason for using these other items, always put in an actual name and password that you know can connect to both SQL Server and Analysis Server. When you advance to next, you're going to name your data source. Microsoft puts spaces in the names when they see the capital letters. I myself am not real inclined to leave the spaces in. I've noticed that in computer technology, a lot of times names with spaces can cause issues. Although, to be fair, I haven't really seen that as an issue in Analysis Server. So, I would recommend that you take out the spaces only as a personal preference. But it's really up to you. I'm going to take them out because that's my personal preference. Hitting finish will make you a data source. And the next step will be going through and setting up a data source view to go along with it. We won't be able to do a lot of testing on that data source until much later. So you kind of have to configure it, hope you got it configured correctly. And then as you start going through the system and making your data source views and the dimensions and finally the cube, you can actually test your data source at that point and then tweak it depending on your needs. Anyway, that's all the things I can think of that you would need to know about creating a data source. And I'm hoping that it wasn't too difficult to follow and it made sense. I certainly know a lot of people have a number of problems getting this to work. And I'm hoping that this video will assist those folks. Thanks for watching.